Blobbing. This fun activity to do in the summer pushes you to new heights, literally. But did you know that while getting splashed around, you're participating in an activity directly related to physics?
In the act of blobbing, one apparent physics concept is the concept of projectile motion. This motion is when there is both a y velocity, which is vertical movement, and an x velocity, which is the horizontal movement. In projectile motion, the x movement stays constant, the velocity of the x is constant, while the y velocity changes due to the acceleration of gravity in the motion. So in blobbing, when the person that is blobbing falls down, the blobbed person sits at an angle on the blob machine, and so when the blob gets forced downward, the person gets forced both upward and to the side, which results in a parabolic movement, and they fall safely into the water. Another physics concept present in the act of blobbing is the conservation of momentum. Momentum is basically the oomph of movement, whereas if you have a great mass and a great velocity, you'll have a very large momentum. And a aspect of momentum is that it always conserved. So initial momentum equals final momentum. And a greater mass times a greater velocity will always equal a greater momentum. And in blobbing, this is important because if the blobber has a great mass and a great velocity, they will have a very large momentum. So then, when the momentum is conserved into the smaller person who is being blobbed, who has a smaller mass, their velocity will have to increase to make up for that greater momentum with the greater mass, and thus they will go higher and further off of the blob. Whereas, conversely, if a small person blobs a very large person, the momentum will be smaller because the mass times velocity is smaller with a smaller person, and then when that momentum is conserved to the larger person who has a larger mass, their velocity will have to be smaller to make up for the smaller mass initially.
Near, far, wherever you are, I believe that's the heart does.
So this blobbing fails because the person who is being blobbed is sitting horizontally on the blob, and therefore when the transfer of momentum occurs, they just go straight up because they only have y velocity. Versus if they were sitting on the edge, they would also have x velocity, and therefore projectile motion would occur. So therefore, this video is a fail.
This girl is on fire!
In this video, it's important to know that the higher height that the person who's blobbing the other person jumps from will affect how far the person being blobbed goes. So if they jump from a higher height, they'll have more time to accelerate, so therefore their final y velocity will be higher, and therefore the person being blobbed will go further. However, in this video, the person who was blobbing the other person was of a relatively small mass, and they're jumping from a pretty small height. Therefore, their final y velocity wasn't that high, and therefore their momentum wasn't that high as well. Therefore, the person just fell off the side and didn't go anywhere. However, if a person of a very large mass and a person jumped from a very high height, they would have a high velocity and a high mass, therefore a high momentum, that'd be transferred to the person being blobbed, and they would go very far. So therefore, this video is a fail.
This video is a fail because the girl thinks that when she jumps onto the blob, she'll just bounce back up, but that doesn't happen because her momentum is just transferred into it, and there's no one to project her off of the blob. So in conclusion, she's an idiot. She's stupid. She's not thinking.
And that's a wrap. Remember when you're out blobbing this summer to projectile that motion and transfer that momentum.